So welcome to Policy in Action at Home. My name is Regina Celestine Williams, and I am the Executive Director of SV at Home, and it's good to be in the space with you all today. Policy in Action at Home is a monthly informal brown bag discussion convening housers to engage on hot housing topics. Every month, we select a topic or current event, bring in an expert to give a brief presentation, and then open up the discussion to ask questions, float new ideas, and identify potential areas for shared action. Today, I'm very excited that we'll be chatting about shelter, interim, and permanent housing solutions to the needs of people who are unhoused in San Jose. And we have David Lowe and Reagan Henninger here today to chat with us about this topic. We all know that solutions feel challenging to come by. So for these two experts to share with us what we're doing, it's going to be a great discussion, very enlightening, and we're hoping to get a great amount of engagement and questions from you all today. So before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and ceded territory of the indigenous peoples of the Ohlone, Muwekma, Ramaytush, Ohlone, Tamian Nation, and Amar Mutsun, on which we are learning, working, and organizing today. We are committed to honoring and making visible the indigenous people and tribes that were intentionally displaced from their land, who may remain here in Silicon Valley and are a part of our community. So with that, I'll turn it over to Allison.
Thank you so much, Regina. So I do just want to cover a few ground rules for our conversation today. We want to make sure that our conversation and relationships are respectful and productive. So please make sure you're kind and courteous to each other, no rude comments or personal attacks. We do encourage asking questions and listening as we learn and engage with each other. Please feel free as we go through the presentation and the conversations to drop any questions you might have in the chat. We do understand sometimes the chat can get lively. So if you find that the chat is distracting you from the content of the conversation, we encourage you to consider closing the chat at least temporarily. Okay, and remember that today's conversation is focused on interim housing, and we're looking forward to a great conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to pass that along to David Lowe. Thanks so much, David.
Thank you, and thanks to SV at Home for hosting us all today for this important conversation. We're pleased to be here. Once again, my name is David Lowe. I'm the Director of Policy and Communications with Destination Home, which is a public-private partnership that's working to end homelessness here in our community. And as we all know, we are facing a true crisis here in our community, a problem that has grown consistently over the past 10 years and really represents one of the biggest challenges we as a community are facing, and how we're going to address the suffering and the people who are unstably housed throughout our community. And so for those of us who've been involved in the work, in 2020, we came back together, and Destination Home played a role in convening our public sector partners, local governments like the city of San Jose, the nonprofits, the heroes on the ground doing a lot of work to assist people experiencing homelessness, housing allies, other private organizations, to develop a common, what we call our common community plan to end homelessness, which is really an idea of having a shared roadmap that everybody in our community can plug into to try to address this great challenge. And in this plan that has now been adopted by several jurisdictions throughout the community, endorsed by organizations like ours, SV at Home, others, we came up with 3 overarching strategies that we thought we needed to do together to really address this crisis. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. That'd be great. I don't want to steal too much of Reagan's thunder here, but you can see it really. And this is really kind of the comprehensive approach we need to take, and we believe we need to take to address this crisis. But as we all know, a plan is only as good as when we put actions behind it. And even though it feels, I know I feel it and others feel like the problem has never been worse, we are starting to see signs that we're making some progress and some hope that we can end homelessness in our community in the years ahead. And that's only because we have great committed partners throughout our community doing this work. And why I'm so pleased that the centerpiece of our conversation today is going to be with the city of San Jose, who has been one of those exemplary partners who's really committed to helping end homelessness in our community. And I'm pleased to introduce my friend, colleague, Reagan Henninger, who's our Deputy Director of the City of San Jose Housing Department, who has been just a fantastic ally in trying to address this crisis. And I spent a little bit of time today to talk about really the the many different strategies the city is employing to address this crisis, how it fits into this broader community plan, and our overarching shared goal, I think, as a community to end homelessness. So Reagan, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks, David. Nice to see everyone. I see a lot of old friends and some new friends here today, so I'm looking forward to talking with you all. I originally thought I was going to talk about interim housing today. And then as Dave and Matthew and I were talking, we really thought that you can't talk about interim housing unless you talk about how it fits into our whole strategy. So today we're going to try and boil the ocean together and cover a lot of ground. But hopefully I can run through these slides pretty quick so that we can save the majority of the time for questions and answers and just a real discussion. As Dave mentioned, these are our strategies, our three primary strategies where we really align all of our efforts. But one thing I did want to mention is that we integrate throughout all of the strategies some very important guiding values, two really important guiding values. First is we raise the voices of people with lived experience of homelessness and really share power with our unhoused and recently unhoused neighbors. And we are really trying to be thoughtful about how we are accountable to people with lived experience and really integrating them into this process in a meaningful and powerful way. And then secondly, but no less important, we're focused on policies and programs that will really address the racial inequities that are present today and reverse the disproportionately high rates of people of color who are unhoused. Next slide, please. So for the city of San Jose, we have a lot happening in the area of policy and really work that addresses the root causes of homelessness. There's a lot on this slide, and I think each of these projects on the slide could probably be its own separate policy and action meeting. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but one theme throughout these initiatives is really for San Jose, the focus on prioritizing and creating housing opportunities for our most vulnerable, people who are extremely low income. And so, for example, our approved Measure E spending plan and our affordable housing investment plan prioritize resources for that extremely low income category. Next slide. So in the last year, our department has really focused on two P's in this category. First is prevention and the second is production. And although it's not on this slide, one major effort that we implemented over the last year has been the city's COVID-19 emergency rental assistance program. The city received $124 million in federal funds for both a local and state program. The state program assisted a little over 10,000 households, and our local program, in partnership with the county and Destination Home and Sacred Heart and so many grassroots partners that I see here today, we helped just in San Jose, we helped about 3,000 households, 98% of which were extremely low income, our most vulnerable residents. Our focus is also on production. We recently announced awards of $150 million in city funding for 11 new affordable housing developments, and these projects will create over 1,200 affordable apartments, of which 450 will be permanent supportive housing units. And in addition, we really have a strong current work in construction. We've got over 400 apartments that are currently under construction and 1,000 that have recently been completed. And then nearly 3,000 affordable apartments that have been preserved in recent years through refinancing that will keep them affordable for 55 plus years. Next slide. So in terms of strategy 3, this is the strategy that's really focused on caring for people who are currently experiencing homelessness, particularly unsheltered homelessness. And our work here is focused on 2 areas. One is encampment services and the other area is interim housing. So I'm going to touch first on encampment services. During COVID-19, the city's response really shifted from an abatement focused way of dealing with encampments where we would abate or close an encampment and our most vulnerable residents would be displaced. And really it was like a game of whack-a-mole. But during COVID, we shifted to a model of letting encampments remain where they are based on CDC guidance. And we really focused on providing services in those encampments to keep spaces clean, and we provided hygiene services and social services. And one thing that we did that I don't know that any other city in the nation did is we implemented a citywide trash service program for encampments. And coming out of COVID, this is a strategy that we have maintained, this encampment management strategy. And right now we're providing regular trash service to over 224 encampments across the city. And the 3 principles of our encampment management strategy are what we call the 3 E's, providing services that are equitable, effective, and efficient. And really abatements are minimized to limit impacting the most vulnerable residents. We do abatements now for health, safety reasons, for blocking right-of-ways, but it's really not a strategy that we lead with. Instead, we are leading with a more human-centered approach where we're providing services where people are. And the other strategy that we've really focused on in the last 2 years is interim housing. You could go to the next slide. So also in response to the pandemic, the council redirected about 17 million in state homeless housing assistance and prevention funds, or HAP funds, and redirected us to build what we call emergency interim housing, which is modular or prefabricated buildings that we purchase and we then place on city-owned land. So in May, we began on the first of 3 new emergency interim housing sites. And between May 2020 and April 2021, we built 3 new EIH sites, totaling 317 new beds for a total construction cost of about $24 million. The current cost to run an EIH site is about $3 to $3.5 million a year. And right now our total operating costs for 3 interim housing sites and our 2 tiny home communities is about $13 million a year. Next slide. So here's some photos of what we built over the pandemic. You can see the modular units that, again, we purchase from a manufacturer, and we put them either on city-owned land, or in some cases we have leased property from Caltrans. These communities have really been operating essentially as non-congregate shelter, but I really like to talk about these communities as shelter reimagined, because we really have been centering the needs of our customers, those who are living on site. I've been in this field for 20 plus years and used to work out of a large shelter building. And traditionally, shelters, I think, have been thought of like warehouses with, one big room and 100 beds in one room. But we've really disrupted that old model of shelter. And these communities are providing individuals with their own room, their own private space, their own bathroom, a door that locks, just like any other human being would want. And we have a level of support on site that is really meant to help individuals when they leave, ensure that they're leaving to stable housing. So just some examples from some of our sites. Our Evans Lane site, which is the picture on the top right. This is a site for families. Last year, we had 74 individuals leave the program, with 90% of them leaving to permanent housing. So quite a big difference than the success you would see in a transitional shelter or in a old way of doing shelter, which often is more like around 10 to 12% of people who leave a traditional shelter leave for permanent housing. So it's quite a big difference. So I think that's it for me, Dave. We covered a lot of ground from permanent to interim, but I really just wanted to provide some context in terms of all of the things that the city is doing. And then I'm hoping we can get into more details, through conversation and questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Reagan, so much for that. There's a lot of information, and I think really reflective of the great work the city's doing, because there's so much. So for those of you listening, please start putting your questions in the chat. I think SV at Home folks can help us moderate, but I did want to follow up on a couple things real quick. And first of all, thank you, Reagan. I think really hearing about the city's approach to interim housing is really helpful and important. These things, the fact that we are trying to provide folks with a more dignified way of having shelter with their own space, and then making sure that there is a path to get them to permanent housing is really huge, because these things are, going to be probably a better situation, a lot of people living on the street, but also not something where it's probably a good place for someone to live for years upon years. So we Destination Home really appreciate that, and thinking about how interim housing fits in the overall system. And the other thing I wanted to touch upon is another kind of, you'd mentioned up front about an important principle, and something we shared is how you're integrating lived experience at these interim housing sites. And a partnership we had with the city was to see how we could engage members of the Lived Experience Advisory Board. And I know there's been a lot of interaction there too. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that, as well as kind of from a city's perspective, how that's played out for you.
Yeah, we really started a project, our fourth emergency interim housing community, which is called Guadalupe Emergency Interim Housing. It's downtown off Taylor Street, and we really wanted to start this project, and from design through construction, through opening day of residents living on site, we really wanted every step of that process to have individuals with lived experience be a part of it and provide their expertise and their consultancy. So thanks to a grant from Destination Home, we've been working with a subcommittee of the Lived Experience Advisory Board, who have been on this journey from the very beginning of building this fourth EIH, which will be 76 units of shelter for single adults. And the Lived Experience Advisory Board have consulted on site designs, everything from where the units are placed on the site, to bike storage, to even the colors of the paint, to the fence surrounding the site. They've really provided us valuable advice and feedback. And now we're moving into a second phase where we're working with this Lived Experience Advisory Board to review the proposed services on site. So we'll be looking at service plans and just how it's all going to work. Again, centering the voice of people with lived experience, and the project's not finished. It'll be finished in December, but what I think is gonna happen is a better project for our customers, the people who live there. And I think that will mean better outcomes for the people there, meaning I hope we transition everyone to a stable housing opportunity.
That's great. And I think, as we all know, right, that takes extra work and it takes more intention. But I really do think that there is that value in doing it. So we really appreciate the city's commitment to think of how we make these things as good as they can be. The other thing that stuck out to me from your presentation was some of those really impressive stats that came on housing production. And, I think many people here know that, at least I believe, and I know a lot of people, studies believe, right, affordable housing is the answer to homelessness. And so to see the city really scale production was really impressive. And the thing that I think always sticks out to me that I don't know if everyone knows, and it's particularly when we hear about all the critiques about the cost and time it does to build housing, but that when it comes to local governments investing in housing, that really only ends up putting in a portion of the cost. And to get that kind of scale is because we're leveraging all sorts of other outside sources of funding. So I'm just kind of curious if there's anything else you could add just for people to help understand in a simple terms, the complex world of affordable housing financing, how this really ends up being a pretty cost-effective investment of local dollars.
Yeah, I think on the cost side, there's a tremendous amount of leverage of other funds or other people's money, which is the best kind of money to spend, that a lot of people don't see. So for example, in that recent NOFA that I mentioned in the slide deck, on average, the city invested $120,000 per door for each of those new developments, while bringing in, over 300 million in outside financing sources. In general, for every $1 that the city invests in an affordable housing unit, we're seeing $4 come in from other sources invested in that project. So there's so much leverage that I think of other funding sources that I don't think people see. But then there's this other added benefit. So for example, the city gets a 55-year deed restriction on the land. And so these rents are set. They will be affordable for a long time to come. In our last NOFA, we actually stated we had a preference for affordable housing developments that on the ground floor could have community serving purposes. So child care centers, for example, or space for nonprofits serving the neighborhood. Quetzal Gardens is a great example of that model. That's affordable housing, but also the home of Somos Mayfair. And then I would say an added benefit that I think is not accounted for in this conversation about cost and the cost of affordable housing is too much. Developers of affordable housing also pay fees. They pay millions of dollars in impact fees that come to the city that also improve conditions of nearby streets and parks. And then lastly, I'd say that the city doesn't have an ongoing cost for affordable developments. It's a one-time cost for us that's actually a loan. So that money does eventually come back to us and we reinvest it in more housing.
Thank you for that. I think that's super helpful. As I keep learning more and more about the finances here too. You really can kind of understand where some of that value comes in. And I did just want to point out, she had one bullet on there for everyone else about affordable housing development, about a dedicated planner position, something Destination Home's been proud to partner on. But what's really exciting too is, we had this theory a while ago. So if we can put some more resources into the planning process, which we know we all can be frustrated by, can we speed it up? And what we saw, we got a recent report back from Reagan's plan department, or the city's plan department, and we saw a 20% reduction in the permitting time it took to get some of these housing developments that really focus on serving people with previous experience of homelessness moving forward. And one we're really excited about too is PATH has a new project up on 4th and Younger, I think it is, and that's going to be in records-breaking time. And I think it's actually scheduled to open soon or will be leasing up. So kudos for really the city on the steps they're doing. And we're hoping other jurisdictions will look into see how we can really take steps to speed up the process so we can get more people into homes quickly.
Well, kudos to Destination Home for funding those planners in our planning department. You know, it really does make a difference when you have that dedicated person to shepherd a project from plan submittal all the way through to, you know, building permits. It makes a tremendous difference, as we saw, as you mentioned, Villas on the Park, but Calabasas Apartments is also a good example of speed.
Yeah. Well, you know, one other thing I wanted to ask Reagan, we'll get over to everyone else's question really soon, is just, you know, we've heard a lot of activity going on around the airport, and a really complicated situation. And again, another issue we could spend a whole lunchtime series going on here too. But since I know it's top of mind for a lot of folks, can you just kind of give a quick update about what, you know, the brief background of what's going on there and kind of how that's going and what's a really tough situation right now?
Sure. So brief background for folks who haven't been following this issue. The city of San Jose owns about 40 acres of vacant land that's just south of the airport. And that land was purchased with grant funding from the Federal Aviation Administration. That area has on and off for as long as I can remember been encamped with homeless individuals. But I would say during the pandemic, we saw the number just grow. And so the FAA notified the city that we were in violation of our grant funding with them because the site is not supposed to have residential uses or people living on site for safety reasons. It's in the runway approach zone, but also there's safety reasons around sound. It's very noisy sound and not healthy for people to actually live there. So we had to, by federal order, tell the FAA how we were going to comply and clear the parcel. So in the San Jose way, we took a human-centered approach, and we told the federal government that we need a year to work with the individuals on the site and offer meaningful housing opportunities, and not just abate the site and displace a bunch of people. So one of the first things we did, and the FAA said okay to that, which is good. So one of the first things we did is we created a name-by-name list of the individuals who were camped at that site. And there were 149 people there. And over the last year, we've been working with those individuals to find housing solutions. And we worked very closely with the County Office of Supportive Housing and our housing authority. And since September of last year, we have housed 174 people who lived on that site. The challenge has been that new people are coming to camp on the site every day. I've seen numbers of 4 new people, 5 new people, 8. The most I've seen in one day is 13 new people coming to that site. It's a very dynamic site, and the scope of the project has been changing, right? Because new people come in, and we also want to offer housing to those folks. So that's been the hardest challenge, is the dynamic nature of that site. But the 40 acres actually has been cleared. I think there's 1 or 2 remaining individuals on the site. We have until the end of next week by the FAA order to have the site cleared. But if you go by that site, you will see that a lot of people have moved over to Columbus Park, which is a city park just across the street. So we'll continue to work with those individuals in that park to find housing opportunities.
Thanks, Reagan. Thanks for an update on that. And that was really tough work to figure out what's the best way to do. So last question I'm going to ask before we hand it over to the chat is, you know, the thought I always have every time I hear about what any one organization or one jurisdiction like the city is doing is, how do you balance all these needs? we all just heard about the tremendous work the city's doing on so many different areas, but we all know we're in a world of limited resources as well as staff. So how do you prioritize? How do you balance those needs? And I would love to hear kind of how the approach or strategy you all have taken in the city, and that may be helpful for others who are in this field.
Yeah, I will say, that's probably one of the hardest parts, right? Is how do we balance all of these competing priorities? And I think that balance is something we struggled with when we were developing the community plan in partnership with you all, Dave, at Destination Home, and the county and the Housing Authority. Is how do you balance keeping the long view and keeping our eye on the ball, which is housing. That's what solves homelessness. But how do you take care of people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness right now and living in some deplorable conditions? And so how do you balance those needs? One example, I think, of the city's approach of balancing needs with limited resources is our Measure E spending plan. We have a council approved spending plan where it really, I think, is illustrative of how we balance needs. So 40% of the funds from Measure E are dedicated to creation of affordable housing for extremely low income households. Again, that is the city's priority, is that ELI income bracket, because those are our most vulnerable residents. And then 30% is dedicated to low income households. And we have 10% for homelessness prevention, and 15% of the funds is for homeless programs like our interim housing communities.
Thank you so much, Reagan. Thanks for sharing all this great information. I want to open it up and to make sure we're hearing from everyone else here. So I'm going to turn over to somebody on the SB at Home team to help us kind of walk through the questions we're getting from the chat and what else they've collected.
Hi, yeah, thanks, David. My name is Kenneth Javier Rosales, Planning Senior Associate with SB at Home. And so we have a question sent in early that asks specifically about how interim shelter has gotten so much attention recently, and whether it is the solution in the way that some have presented it.
I'm happy to take my first thoughts on, then we'll love to hear Reagan thing. I mean, we talked about it a little bit earlier before, my perspective on it. I think we absolutely need to have more interventions that are helping address people and get them into a better situation immediately, right? We have far too many people on the street, people suffering in unsafe conditions, and really promising from like the approaches Reagan and others taken to make these type of interim housing a little more dignified way of finding shelter. But I just don't see where this can be the solution, right? These are a better place than living on the streets, but is it anyone that we or any one of our family members, loved ones would want to live for more than a short time? And so I really think we need to continue finding ways to help people find a permanent home. I was really impressed to hear how Reagan and the success they've had in making that continuum, but that's only going to keep happening if we continue investing in permanent housing, housing subsidies, other ways, so we have that continuum. Otherwise, I fear that if we go too much of a knee jerk and just go all in on this without thinking of those long-term solutions, we end up in an area like we see in New York City and elsewhere, where there's such a focus on shelter, people are living there years after years. And so I see it as a key solution, but not the solution. And we got to figure out a way of how we can balance those things.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. One of the things that San Jose is struggling with as we're building these interim housing communities is the ongoing costs to provide the services and operate them. I mentioned we have 2 tiny home communities and 3 interim housing, or those modular housing communities. So 5 right now in total. We have a 6th that's under construction and will be complete in December. And then the city council approved building 300 more units of interim housing. So just the 5 communities that exist today cost $13.8 million a year to operate. And I will say we are providing a high level of service because we're serving people of all abilities and disabilities. And so we want to make sure we have the appropriate level of services on site. But when we add those new interim housing communities that are in our pipeline, it's going to add about another $9 million a year to operate. And we don't have an identified ongoing funding source. The city council has identified some general fund money in the sort of near term 4 or 5 year forecast, but like over the long haul, we don't have an identified funding source. And so to be honest, like that's what keeps me up at night, is keeping these communities operating.
You know, just doing a little, well, I won't even claim it's back in envelope math, but just thinking about that 13.8 million in operating costs for these sites. I mean, on an ongoing basis, that operating cost is probably higher, right, than when we're talking about what we need to put in for some of these permanent affordable housing developments.
You know, perhaps, Dave, I think it had that kind of detailed cost analysis hasn't been done yet. I know we're working on it. And we're also working with San Francisco Foundation right now to study how the city's interim housing communities are operating and the level of services we're providing. And is there anything we can do to reduce costs? But the challenge is, I think people change other people's lives. And so having the right level of support and services is really critical. So for example, when we're taking and housing people from an encampment in one of our interim communities, we're taking people again of all abilities and disabilities. We may have someone that's working part-time at Whole Foods and living outside, and we may have someone who is unable to care for themselves. Literally, they need help, you know, going to the bathroom. And so our interim housing communities are able to support people of all abilities and disabilities. But, you know, there's a cost to that.
And an important cost to figure out how people are successful. So certainly a big challenge. I know you all are figuring out as we figure out how to scale these strategies.
Yeah, we have a few more questions. So the San Jose City Council has recommended more of these communities in more different places. We know there's a real concern about how we are going to pay for this kind of ongoing commitment. We also know it has been challenging to find locations that don't trigger significant resistance from communities. So we're getting a lot of questions in the chat. You know, how is this progressing? Some of the questions, you know, also included what makes a good location? Have we identified locations? Do we have the resources to follow through on this? I know you touched on this, but there is an interest on how the costs are broken down as well.
I can start on the siting and the locations and what makes a good site. Ideally, what makes a good site are the same criteria that makes a good site for a market rate housing development or affordable housing development. People want to be close to amenities, people want to be close to transportation, and people want to live in good, safe neighborhoods. So I don't think that criteria necessarily changes for an interim housing community. I think the challenge that San Jose has had is we're trying to use city property. So I think people might think that the city owns like large unoccupied vacant land, which it unfortunately isn't the case. So a lot of the city property that we own are kind of random parcels next to the side of a freeway or stuff like that, but not really a large vacant developable piece of land. Like that's not plentiful in San Jose. So that's been a challenge, is how do we find city-owned pieces of land? And so we've had to get creative. Our Guadalupe interim housing community is one of those examples. We sort of had this triangular vacant piece of property next to Taylor Street, but it wasn't big enough to build an entire community. So we actually had to use some of a city-owned parking lot that's right next to it. And in other cases, we have leased property from Caltrans. And In one case, we also leased property from BTA. So siting, I think, is a challenge for whatever we're building, whether that's an interim housing site or affordable site. Siting is one of the biggest challenges. And then in terms of cost breakdown, it varies. So the average cost per unit is about $100,000 for an interim housing, but it varies. So one example of that variation is at Guadalupe interim housing site. We actually had a philanthropic donation. Sandhill donated about $7 million in the prefabricated units. So that brought our cost down to about $88,000 a unit. So just it's sort of varied depending on what modular units we're going with and sort of if there's a philanthropic donation. And we did have a philanthropic donation at our Evans Lane community as well. And I think you had a third question in there, but I can't remember what it was.
I think you touched on it, but I think it might have been, do we have the resources to follow through on this? Was that it?
I feel like with any of our programs, whether we're funding street outreach or we're funding, the building of affordable housing or we're building interim housing, like none of our programs are resourced to the need, right? Like we have more need than we have resources. But in San Jose, we've been able to identify some of the state HAP money that I mentioned. And then we've also put in, I also mentioned Measure E money.
And I'll just mention too, when it comes to the funding that we need or the sites we find, that is where, we at Decision have been trying to really advocate more for that. And but really where we think all of you can come in too, because we need to keep that pressure up. I know there's a common perception that we put a lot of money in the state and others have put a lot of money in recently, but we haven't gotten that ongoing sustainable sources we need to really meet the need and continue this going on. So I do think we're going to hear a lot more about pushes for that and maybe pushes back against it in the year ahead. And for all of those of you who are involved in this work, we'd really love your voices to join us, think how we can get to those solutions ongoing. More questions, Kenneth?
Yeah, I think we'll move on to the next one. And so, I know it feels like, we're in a time where, when we're fatigued by all this and, we're lacking patience and, this is having an impact on how we think about and treat people. Reagan touched on this, but we know shelter and temporary options just don't support people the way that permanent housing does. Can you talk a little bit about what we know from the research about how and why housing ends homelessness and why the transition from interim to permanent housing is so central to your work?
Sure, I can start off and I would love Reagan to add. I think that's a really good point. There's a lot of information and what I think is misinformation out there recently that really is just conflating all the issues and taking the fact that we have a crisis and it feels worse to making people think nothing works, which is just far from the truth. There have been bazillions of studies that look at how people experiencing homelessness do when they're placed in a permanent housing. And overwhelmingly, when we're talking about permanent supportive housing, which is a permanent home with services to help them address whatever challenges they're facing, we see astronomical rates of keeping people housed. Here in Santa Clara County, our retention rate for permanent housing is at like 95%, and it has been for many years. And we were actually part of a study when we first launched a program that UCSF did with us and looked at that over time. And we saw it's not just, in that first year they stay housed, but people stay housed for years, and you see an overwhelming high retention rate. So we know it works. And we know that if we keep building more affordable housing and this type of permanent supportive housing, we can keep people housed. And just because, unfortunately, we have all these, systemic forces pushing more people into homelessness doesn't mean that one of these solutions we found doesn't work. And so we definitely certainly believe that we must continue investing in permanent housing solutions. We need to have it as a part of a continuum, but there really is no substitute when it comes to actually getting people housed and keeping people housed that have this type of solution.
I think just one other thing I would add is I feel like there's this narrative right now that people don't want housing, or the people who are unhoused right now are, the majority of them are mentally ill. I mean, the whole narrative goes on. And there are countless research papers out there that demonstrate that high rent levels and very low rental vacancy rates, that those cities have high rates of homelessness. So really, it illustrates that homelessness is a housing problem. It's that simple. And our data, every time we do the homeless census, like 90+ people want meaningful housing. It's just not available. And the number one reason of why people are homeless is that they couldn't afford rent. So homelessness is a housing issue.
And for those of you interested more, there's a book that was just written with that title, I think exactly. Homelessness is a housing, actually homelessness is a housing problem. And they did exactly that analysis Reagan said. And they show, you can see a correlation of communities with high rent burdens, high rents, high correlation to homelessness, not so much with mental health and substance abuse.
Yeah.
So we know at an individual level, obviously issues intermix, but it really leads us, for those who've been in the field, to say like, okay, there's a lot of things we need to address, but we want to solve this problem. At its core, it is a housing issue.
Thanks, David and Reagan. We have one more question, closing. And if you could wrap it up in 3 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes. How do we do a better job of getting community support? Homelessness is the top concern if you ask people, but we continue to experience community resistance and fear. We also know that the work that is being done is often less visible than the hardship people see every day and is often misunderstood.
It's really hard, I mean, some of you know, before I moved over to Destination Home, I worked in local government, actually worked very closely with Reagan, the city, and it is hard, right? We all have in our lives what we see in our world, and usually that's what we see in our neighborhoods or when we're driving around the streets, and we just think of how that affects us. But I think the first step is, and it starts with us who care about the issue and how we can grow, how we can see this as a really human problem, right? Our shared humanity of how this is addressing us, and that if we want to solve it, we as a community all have to be part of the solution. And sometimes that means in thinking about things that we don't love or that we might not like, but think about how we can be stronger if we get there. And, it's not going to be easy. We've seen all this resistance everywhere. We're all doing what we can to do it. But I think if we all can kind of embrace that for ourselves and see how we can bring that message little by little, we can make some progress. And, the thing that gives me hope that over time we can get there is what we saw happen in the pandemic. And we really saw people rally to the side of their neighbors who were suffering, who needed help. And if we can all start thinking, which I think is true, of this homelessness crisis as just a big, long pandemic of urgency that we've kind of collectively as a society swept under the rug for a number of years, if we can channel that same spirit, I think we can get to the solutions we need. We can build the housing we need. We can invest the resources. We can assist our neighbors. But it all starts with us kind of digging inside ourselves and then saying we're going to be part of the solution and work to recruit our friends, our neighbors, our family members to join us.
I think it matters that people show up to policy discussions around housing. Oftentimes when we're trying to find a site for whatever it is, an affordable housing project, an interim housing community, or even a safe parking program, the majority of people that show up are people that don't want whatever that is in their community, affordable housing or safe parking or interim housing. So that's the narrative that policymakers hear, and I think we have to change that. We have to show up because it matters, and getting friends and neighbors to show up or write or email, it does matter. And I also think as much as we can as a community, share our successes and share about what we're doing and the people that we're housing. I think that also does provide some counterbalance to this narrative of, nothing's being done and, there's thousands of people outside, when really we're doing a lot. we housed over 1,800 people just in the last 6 months. We're doing stuff, but you know, there's just a crazy narrative out there right now.
And just to piggyback on that part too, I mean, there's a lot I think we can all do, but I think for those of you who've taken the time to learn about what's going on here about it, I think that's one place you can be helpful too, because we all know, right? If we don't know, we just see what we see with our eyes, and that doesn't look good. And not to say that that isn't important to know and to keep us moving forward, but I think it is helpful if we, you know, who have taken the time to learn about it can help people understand the work that's going on and how that is having some success. If we can scale it and be more strategic and innovative with it, it starts giving us all some momentum that we can address this crisis if we all dig in together.
Cool. I think, yeah, we're coming up on time. It's great timing. And thank you so much. Just, you know, really appreciate your time, your effort, the emotional toll and everything that comes with this really, really hard work. David, engagement is, you know, a priority, as you know, we were just discussing. And so I was wondering if you have any additional resources, you know, you could share with us, or call to actions as well.
Sure. I mean, I would say, you know, we kind of scratched the surface here. I think there were a lot of questions in the chat that we didn't get to. So feel free to reach out to Reagan or I or SV at Home, and we'd be happy to give you more information. But a lot of this stuff does live on our various websites. So San Jose Housing Department, I think it's sjhousing.org. A lot of information about all the strategies you heard about from them. If you go to our website, destinationhomesv.org, you can hear more about what we're doing as our part of the problem, but also some of the educational resources we've put out. We created a section called Understanding Homelessness that starts putting out some of these facts and help people understand the crisis. And then really, I think the biggest thing is, again, just get involved. And there's a lot of different ways you get involved. SV at Home, that you're taking a first step here. They're activating people and educating people. A lot of ways to get involved there. We have a Housing Ready Communities initiative that really tries to rally people who are interested in proven solutions to see how we can say yes when these housing initiatives come up. And I know there are others like the Housing Advocacy Coalition and others. So YIMBY, get involved, learn more, educate yourself. And then, as Reagan said, show up when these decisions are being made. I've worked for some politicians, and I'll tell you, even though we don't think it makes a difference, they notice when people come and speak. And from that to serving on commissions to educating your neighbors is all a role we can play. And I think there are a lot of different avenues for folks to get involved if you're interested.
Great. If I could jump in, Matthew Reed from Silicon Valley at Home. We put some links to some of the references that David had. I noted earlier in the chat that we will share both those links and a copy of this presentation. A couple of folks have said there was a lot of information in one place. Thank you, Reagan, for figuring out how to, I forget the language you use, put it all, boil it down. I did want to take the opportunity to mention that there is a concrete opportunity next week to plug in and get involved. We know that the political courage to stand up to some of the neighborhood resistance, we need to be part of that. Elected officials need to be part of that. And so this is a timely discussion. On Tuesday, there's a tremendously important development that is coming before the City Council in Santa Clara. It's at 1601 Civic Center. It's 108 units. It's a tremendously important project because of its access to transit and its commitment to serving the lowest income folks in that community, including people who are coming out of being unhoused. So I'm gonna put a link to a partner action tool from the Housing Action Coalition, who has also been involved in this effort. And I really urge you all to take a look, send a letter, I show up. There's some general talking points, but I think we all have our own emotional and personal connection to this, and that's really what people need to hear. So thank you so much for coming. I'm going to hand it off quickly to either, I believe it's Allison, to do a little bit of a closing for us. And thank you so much for coming. It's great to have you. Thank you again, David and Reagan.
Thank you, Matthew. And wow, what a rich conversation, Reagan and David. Thank you for that. At SV at Home, we believe that everyone deserves a safe, stable home. And if you do too, we invite you to join us as a member. When you join SV at Home, we can leverage our resources magnify our voices, and advance strategic collaborative solutions to California's affordable housing crisis that meet both our local and our regional needs. Your membership helps support our work, including educational events like this one and other policies in action like today's. So you can find the link to join us in the chat, and together we can work towards solving the Bay Area's housing crisis. We do also have a quick 3-question poll. If you can take just a moment to let us know how we did with the event today. Your feedback is really valuable to us. We want to make sure that we are creating programming that is useful to local advocates, that is helpful in helping you understand the current events that are so important, and helping you be well equipped to engage and advocate in your communities to help advance solutions to our affordable housing crisis. So if you can take just a few minutes to answer those quick 3 questions, we really appreciate it. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and have a lovely weekend.